we begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledge that their lands were never ceded. I also want to acknowledge Stephen Stewart, Julie and Barbara, who should be online from Japan. Hi, Julianne, I hope you're having a horrible time. Just kidding. So this is a really good milestone for Stephen. It's been a while, it's been an adventure, it's been a great journey of knowledge for all of us. So Stephen has worked on international development in the Pacific and Southeast Asia for the last 25 years, is it, Stephen? Yeah. He's developed a passionate interest in Pacific public policy on education and employment through his work in the World Bank. And he also did publications on workforce policy as well for the Solomon Islands. He has worked with the Australian government in Cambodia, Myanmar, and most recently, Nauru. Stephen's thesis examines the politics of employment and employment policy in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and he uses case studies to approach his research. And I'll leave it to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Michelle. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge those of you in the audience who've travelled far in person or online to join us today, even possibly from Port Sudan, and taken time out of your busy day for this presentation. This presentation proceeds through 5 parts: the policy challenge, the research, countries, cases, and findings. Better jobs and livelihoods have been voiced as a priority by Pacific peoples, but employment in the Pacific has been described as a wicked public policy problem. Higher education is limited, as are formal wage jobs. The economic growth and private sector growth needed for increased employment at scale is limited in Pacific states. Youth populations are large, with many more people joining the workforce than jobs available. Labour markets don't function to deliver qualified labour to meet employers' needs, and there are skills mismatches. This has impacts on poverty, underdevelopment, and politics, including youth civil unrest, as seen in Solomons, Tonga, Papua New Guinea, and Vanuatu. Change has come from overseas labour opportunities in the last 2 decades, and external aid donors have been influential. So why is employment so difficult in Pacific states? There are varied reasons. Economic and geographic structures constrain employment growth, and there are systemic institutional capacity and resourcing problems. Pacific employment policy responses vary with mixed impacts. Some of these responses have had unclear outcomes, and policy trends in employment have been unclear. Importantly, where economic dynamics are not entirely rational, the question arises of whether political factors shape employment policymaking. So why is policy unpredictable in Pacific states? A broader problem is that Pacific development goals are frequently articulated, but implementation is very mixed. Why is this? Delivery has been most difficult where development needs are greatest and corruption is high. Globally, in policymaking, different institutions, rules and norms guiding actors' behaviour can explain differences in growth, development, governance, service delivery, and the failure of markets such as labour markets. Institutions and institutional change and stability can be explained by political economy factors. From global experience, there are various policies and institutions that matter for different policy and development delivery. Programmatic policies deliver broader, longer-term public benefit, but corruption has been called the most important informal institution. Clientelism has been described as contingent exchange between patrons and clients from which others can be excluded. Kahn and North considered patronage, clientelism, and rent-seeking to be pervasive in developing country policymaking. The hypothesis emerging for this thesis is that political economy dynamics shape policymaking. Political economy analysis of institutions, actors, and incentives can help identify factors in policymaking, and critical analysis of policy can identify the power dynamics shaping agency in policymaking. So the research question of this thesis is, what factors influence policy responses to employment in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu? Answering this question raises a series of further questions. What structures, institutions, and dynamics shape policymaking? Who are the key actors in employment policy responses? What are their objectives and incentives? How have specific policies developed? How does policy framing, development, implementation, and change vary? What decisions were made by who, how, and why? How have formal and informal institutions been contested, and how have officials responded to these pressures? And how has reform been initiated, enabled, negotiated, and resisted? How has change happened? There is a niche for this research within existing literature. Economic and technical analysis, data and policy prescriptions abound, but not explanations for different policy pathways in Pacific countries. The research niche is understanding of the role of political factors and institutions in explaining different policy responses to employment, even in similar contexts. In this research, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. This seeks to provide a better understanding of the politics of Pacific policymaking on employment, including formal and informal institutions. To answer this research question, I used qualitative research, which is best placed to provide a deep understanding of this research topic, and a synthesis of disciplinary approaches, political, economic, and sociological, which is also important to build a comprehensive understanding of these factors. The research approach includes critical policy analysis of policy responses using political economy analysis, policy process tracing, and policy ethnography, which is relevant for policy areas which shape and order people's lives. In this research, I applied a political economy framework for critical analysis of policy development. This included 4 stages. Firstly, problem identification. Secondly, context, the environment, structures, and resources which shape policymaking. Third, critical policy analysis of the formal and informal institutional arrangements that policy actors express agency within to develop, deliver, resist, or change policies. And fourth, analysis which identifies how structures, resourcing, institution, and agency combine to form the factors influencing policymaking. The research approach triangulated 3 types of data: statistical and budget data, which included demographic, economic, and labour market data, and case study-specific budget and student data; document analysis of institutions, including legislation, policies, plans, reports, and media articles; and semi-structured interviews with 81 policy stakeholders with a focus on responsible government units and national and foreign stakeholders, rather than targeting beneficiaries. I then triangulated these 3 types of data to identify factors in policymaking, rather than undertake rigorous cross-case comparison. The research approach therefore includes some deliberate methodology choices, including a synthesis of disciplines rather than depth in one discipline, and use of case studies to enable deeper understanding rather than generalizable findings. So on the countries and cases, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu share similar contexts for policymaking and similar employment challenges. The 2 policy case areas I selected were 2 high priority, high profile, and highly contested employment policy areas: government-funded overseas tertiary scholarships and overseas labour mobility. The case study period was from 2007 to 2019, with the exception of Vanuatu government-funded scholarships that were established in 1997. I focused on responsible government units, which were roughly comparable in both countries: 2 Ministry of Education tertiary scholarships units and 2 labour mobility sending units. The employment context of Solomon Islands and Vanuatu shares a lot of similarities, as does the context for policymaking. Both are geographically segmented island polities with social dynamics of island allegiances. Politics is short-term, transactional, localised, and clientelist. There are limited but strengthening formal institutions, and informal institutions are influential in driving politics. Political dynamics challenge predictable and rational policymaking and delivery on formal policy commitments, but there are distinct political and institutional factors which shape policymaking differently in the 2 contexts. Institutional hybridity is important to explain Pacific policymaking. There's been significant theory and debates about custom and clientelism in Pacific states, particularly in Melanesia. IAFI found Pacific politics and policymaking to be focused on short-term, politicised local agendas. Hassel found clientelism flowing through all levels of Pacific government. Morgan found clientelism in Melanesia to be aligned with custom and Wontok provisioning. Corbett, in his study of Pacific politicians, found constituents criticising political corruption, but still expecting their MPs to deliver them rents. Pacific definitions of corruption are unclear. Gregoire Nemtic found corruption emerging in the clash between Western and local authority. A significant debate has been whether the Wontok system in Solomon Islands was behind corruption, as Fukuyama argued, or whether there was more rational self-interest of voters within the Solomon Islands political economy, as argued by Huck. The first case study issue is Solomon Islands government-funded overseas tertiary scholarships. And this is probably the case study that really started off my interest in this field. This has been a long-standing priority due to limited local higher education and the elite status of scholarships from the independence era. It's been a significant investment, in some years allocated up to 30% of education budget, benefiting as few as 1% of total students. It's faced a long-term tertiary education financing challenge. As one participant said, everyone wants a piece of the cake. After the conflict of the tensions, politicised and personalised selection pressures increased. There was surging tertiary demand, to which officials responded with budget diverted from basic education goals. Government responses to the problems of tertiary scholarships have included audit investigations into scholarships management, and Ministry of Education led and donor-supported management strengthening and policy reform. Despite progress, personalised pressures have persisted. These two tables illustrate the long-term high expenditure on overseas tertiary scholarships in Solomon Islands budget. Both tables look at recurrent budget, routine expenditure to maintain service delivery, distinct from development budget to create new assets. In the upper table, lower and upper range estimates of tertiary scholarships expenditure in orange illustrate that recurrent expenditure on tertiary education is consistently higher than routine expenditure on primary education in green, even though many times more students access primary education. In the lower table, in the case study period, recurrent expenditure on overseas tertiary scholarships took a large proportion of Solomon Islands' entire government recurrent budget, as high as over 10% in 2017, with volatility between allocated budget in blue and actual expenditure in orange. On Vanuatu government-funded scholarships, previously there was a reliance on donor-funded scholarships, but VGFS was established in 1997 with Australian aid project support. In the following 2 decades, there was surging tertiary student demand and rapid increase in budget expenditure. Politicised and personalised selection pressures worsened with Vanuatu's political instability. Short-term ministers of education prioritised personal selection of scholarship students. This attracted donor, civil society and media pressure for change. There were multiple similarities between the tertiary scholarships policy cases. Very similar policy responses included revised education acts, new demand-driven skills policies, national universities established in the case period, and attempted loan schemes. In both, there was elite capture and influence over policymaking. External donors were influential, but with unintended consequences. Political commitment was variable. Policy elites opposed clientelist pressures, but at times participated in them, such as when their children wanted a scholarship. In both, accountability relationships had an important role, and formal institutions strengthened over time, such as legislation and management systems. But there were critical differences between the 2 tertiary scholarships policy cases. Accountability institutions and incentives vary. For example, in Solomon Islands, where one interviewee called the Ministry of Education the Ministry of Overseas Scholarships, because that's where people saw its focus. Only in Solomon Islands was informal practice institutionalised as the category of constituency awards, while personalised selection was sanctioned and covert in Vanuatu. The broader political environment was a key difference. While post-conflict Solomon Islands saw increased corruption after the tensions, the jailing of 14 MPs in Vanuatu created significant political change. This was seen as a strength of Vanuatu's accountability institutions, with increased sanctions for political corruption and new, more technocratic politicians elected in 2016 who led reforms. Vanuatu also had a policy community, policy networks, and collective action to launch multi-stakeholder changes, including post-secondary education and training reform, a new university with multiple international linkages, and a scholarships loan scheme. So onto the second case study area of labour mobility, which has been the most significant employment policy response in Pacific Island countries in the last 2 decades, generating what has been called a triple win, a major economic employment opportunity to workers sending countries and labour receiving countries, including employers. It has been a focus of donors, governments, and the private sector. This research considered policy on participation in key schemes in New Zealand and Australia, including the Recognised Seasonal Employer Scheme in New Zealand, the Seasonal Worker Program, and Pacific Labour Scheme in Australia. Vanuatu secured the largest number of workers of all Pacific countries by the end of the case study period. However, Solomon Islands much fewer in the first 12 years, despite strong job seeker demand and development need. This research asks why, and what are the policy institutional factors in this different outcome. This table shows that Vanuatu had the largest proportion of participation share by country across the RSE and SWP schemes to 2018-19. On the left, Solomon Islands had the 5th largest around the middle. The blue column is the Seasonal Worker Program participation, and orange the Recognised Seasonal Employer Scheme. This next table compares RSE and SWP participants in Vanuatu and Solomon Islands across the case study periods. This table shows that from 2007-08, Vanuatu's participation in the RSE, in red, started strong at 1,700 workers and was later to be closely matched by the SWP in yellow after rapid growth, together totaling 10,000 workers a year in 2018-19 from Vanuatu. Solomon Islands worker numbers in blue started much smaller and lagged much further behind throughout the period, totaling only around 1,000 workers in 2018-19. Solomon Islands labour mobility presented a paradox of great development need but slow take-up. Solomon Islands faced long-term external migration barriers, very low out-migration rate, and very limited diaspora. It had limited government sending capacity and poor agency coordination. Solomon Islands was a late mover, slow to start, with lower numbers in the RSE, late to pilot the SWP scheme, and low worker numbers. Agency coordination was poor, impeded by mutual mistrust and perceptions of corruption. There was high demand from workers for opportunities, and their frustration led to visa overstaying in Australia as an alternative and setting up of alternative schemes such as the Canadian Citrix scheme in Guadalcanal. There were unintended political consequences of protection from corruption. Donors and the government's labour mobility unit wanted independence from political interference, but this limited political and elite commitment to labour mobility. But there was a significant increase in donor and national leadership from 2015 and a rapid growth in worker numbers, but controlled by donors and significantly subject to donor capacity supplementation. Vanuatu labour mobility also started with external migration barriers and very low levels of out-migration. However, Vanuatu had some labour mobility to New Caledonia over a long period, and also cruise ships employment from around 2002. Vanuatu featured early advocacy by leaders from the independence era, including Marilyn Temacon, who advocated to Australian Foreign Minister Downer and organised a petition of over 9,000 signatures, advocating for access to Australia's labour market. Vanuatu enjoyed a first mover advantage in the RSE scheme through selection by the World Bank and connection to New Zealand employers. Labour Commissioner Lionel Calawat's early leadership was important. Vanuatu also enacted dedicated legislation, a Seasonal Worker Act in 2007, and developed a prioritised government light model which supported labour sending. Vanuatu achieved the broadest nationwide participation of the 4 policy cases. However, this brought problems of success. This included a contested agent model and concerns of worker exploitation, as well as inequity in participation, and emerging corruption, electoral patronage, and nepotism. It wasn't until 2019 that a comprehensive national labour mobility policy was developed, but this appeared to be more of a donor signal, and problems of success continued. So there were similarities between the two labour mobility policy cases. Both faced dominant external policy settings, and both faced historical migration barriers and employer demand scheme rules and policy changes set from New Zealand and Australia. Demand by job seekers was massive, but local and resources and capacity for labour sending was limited. Both countries attempted an approach of protection from politics, but in both, nepotism and corruption emerged. Domestic political commitment varied. Both countries experienced long periods of implementation before donor-supported national policy frameworks were launched in 2019 with uncertain impact. But there were key differences between the two cases. Vanuatu's early and wide participation benefited from its networked multi-stakeholder local advocacy and coordination from the start. In Solomon Islands, coordination among essential actors was impeded by a lack of local leadership or external links and mistrust among key actors. Vanuatu developed hybrid institutional arrangements relying on nepotism in links and selection and political linkages. But in Solomon Islands, political commitment was actively prevented. As a result, Vanuatu was characterised by strong local leadership, while Solomon Islands featured stronger donor control and capacity supplementation. With wide participation, in the period, only Vanuatu experienced problems of success to the extent of impacting national politics. So finally, the findings of my research. I find 6 factors influencing employment policy responses in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. Firstly, broader political economy dynamics shape policymaking. These were more similar as both countries were segmented polities. This shaped politics. In both countries, there were systemic constraints on formal institutions, small size and under-resourcing of government units, and limited capability to deal with surging student and job seeker demand. This sustained demand for external aid funding. Arrangements between formal and informal institutions were important, with formal institutions contested by informal pressures. Remaining factors relate to political agency, which varied more significantly between the cases. The fourth factor was how policy actors engaged with clientelism, which varied widely between preventing, exposing, engaging in, mediating, and resisting corrupt practices and clientelism. Fifth, who had power and voice to shape policy and how they shaped policy mattered. This included political actors, bureaucrats, societal elites, and development partners. 6 were variations in accountabilities, incentives, and policy commitment, shaping policies differently and shaping both change enablers and resistors. The title of this thesis is That's Where the Politics Comes In. And indeed, I have found that in structurally similar contexts with similar policy problems and resourcing and similar policy choices, political agency is key to explain different policy pathways to delivery and change. As well as broader political economy dynamics, I found that distinct social sector policy dynamics, such as surging student demand, elite status of policies, and the higher ability for implementation in social sectors to change policies, also shaped policy pathways differently from other sectors. How each country and policy area negotiated formal and informal institutional balances can also explain differences. Who had agency mattered. Not only bureaucrats and political actors had agency, but also societal elites and donors. Responding to debates about whether culture drives clientelism and policy pathways in Pacific states, I generally found that differences in accountabilities and incentives in country and policy areas appeared to matter more obviously than cultural factors. Finally, I also found policy feedback. While rarely studied, these social sector policy areas are themselves in turn shaping national political dynamics. I'll now explore these findings in a little more detail in remaining slides. Firstly, differences in broader political economy dynamics shaped different policy pathways. The defining critical juncture in Solomon Islands political economy was the tensions, after which there was a durable political economy dynamic and incentives with re-established institutional arrangements after the tensions. Natural resource revenues provided strong political economy drivers for transactional politics. In Vanuatu, there was much more political instability, and the critical juncture in the political economy dynamic was the 2015 jailing of 14 MPs, after which there was a new leadership cohort and a period of political stability. Economic drivers included more exposure to the business sector. Vanuatu featured an Anglophone-Francophone language divide and stronger local and regional policy networks. There were also social sector dynamics which shaped budgets and policymaking differently. A key issue was constrained resourcing relative to rapid growth of eligible students and job seekers. These social policy areas experienced specific budget decision-making pressures. For scholarships, elite and clientelist interests were prioritised. However, in Vanuatu, there was a direct budget trade-off of basic education resourcing, which became a greater political priority, especially in cyclone response when schools were closed because of cyclone damage and needed funding to reopen. In both countries, bureaucrats led a shift to longer-term policy goals with donor support, but this was more successful in Vanuatu. In labour mobility, there was significantly job seeker demand, which impacted frontline bureaucrats, but not so much domestic budget choices. Institutional negotiation shaped policy delivery and reform. This looked different in each of the policy areas. In Solomon Islands tertiary scholarships, politicised selection and informal practice became a formal institution shaped by clientelism. For Vanuatu government scholarships, the informal practice of politicised selection became sanctioned and covert. For Solomon Islands labour mobility, prevention of politics limited political or elite commitment. Vanuatu labour mobility's privatised model negotiated acceptable arrangements across communities with some nepotism, which enabled nationwide reach. So, who had agency and how was it exerted? A key finding was that there are different conditions under which political actors could commit to reforms and programmatic policy. Their power is not perfect. They were subject to clientelist and societal pressures. This research identified instances of more developmental and programmatic local policy leadership under certain conditions. This research also identified how societal elites appeared to have shaped policymaking. Civil society advocacy was limited to one policy case, Vanuatu government-funded scholarships, and not strongly representative of non-elite interests. Non-elites, the majority of the population in both countries, had more constrained agency in policymaking. They did exert localised and personalised pressure on politicians and bureaucrats, which did not translate into programmatic policy. Aid donor conditionality and support had mixed effects and unintended consequences. It was most effective in supporting locally led policy change when coherent, sustained, and not compromised by transactional, short-term, or higher interests. Variation in accountability relationships and incentives was really important to defining variation in policy pathways through variations in strength of accountability institutions, sectoral priorities, and choices to prevent or engage in clientelism, and policy actors' commitment to policies and reforms. Among incentives, I found that actors and voters are driven by largely rational incentives rather than distinctly discernible cultural factors. These case studies also present important indications of feedback from these policy areas, with broad-based participation in labour mobility in particular changing political incentives in both states, but also indications that returning tertiary scholarships graduates were leading domestic reforms. There are multiple implications of these findings, which help to better understand Pacific employment policymaking. The role of clientelism in social sector policymaking in Pacific states, the politics of employment policymaking in Pacific states, how macro political dynamics shape policymaking with specific social sector dynamics, how formal and informal institutions are negotiated and how that impacts different policy pathways in Pacific states. And it better understands the agency of actors, how political agency is limited and shaped by societal interests, and a long-term view of the agency of aid actors in Pacific policymaking. The findings indicate rich potential for further research. This includes into Pacific elite politics, local definitions of corruption, local negotiation of hybrid institutional arrangements for policy outcomes, dynamic political changes from policy feedback in social sectors, and conditions under which regional capability and civil society agency influence policy. Finally, I propose the key significance of this research is in reopening a field of politics of labour and employment in Pacific states. And thank you for your attendance and participation, and I welcome questions and discussion.
Stephen, and you did it in better time than what you thought you would. But also in my rush, I apologise, I forgot to introduce myself. And I understand I'm member Colin, who's also on your panel. But let's open it up for questions now.
What is an example of a local definition of corruption? Just so I can contrast it against what we would find as corruption in Australia.
That's a good question, and I haven't actually delved into that in the thesis. I've more left that as an open question. I mean, Elise Huffer wrote about the difference between Pacific definitions and approaches of corruption and the imposition of Western definitions. Often it appears to be assumed that global definitions from Transparency International of what is corrupt behaviour, the getting of an advantage through use of a position or through improper means to the exclusion of other people. There's often an assumption that that Western definition applies universally, but of course, in reality, what is understood, accepted, or rejected as corrupt is highly subjective to context. And Grant Walton has done a lot of interesting work on perceptions of corruption in Papua New Guinea, for example, which by Western measures is a highly corrupt environment, but there's definitely different local definitions of what is appropriate and acceptable or not. So I think it's important to go with those local definitions. However, it can be very confusing because the same behaviour can be interpreted by different people as acceptable or not acceptable, and the same individuals can practice the same practices which they reject or even legislate against when they're actually in positions of power. So short answer, I don't have an answer on local definitions of corruption, but I think it's an important area for research to help identify those because as Gregoire Nimtik has discussed, Pacific Islanders exist and perceived corruption emerges from that clash between Western definitions and traditional structures. Thanks.
Stephen, that was just so interesting. Thank you too much. And I've always thought, I think putting Vanuatu and Solomon side by side is really interesting, and it throws up really interesting things to explore. I mean, you talked about the political shock in Vanuatu with the, was it 2014, 15? You know, there was a big political shock in Solomon Islands, and probably almost a comparable number of members of parliament who were convicted of corruption as a consequence of the Ramsay intervention. And you sort of have to, one of the questions you ask yourself, well, why didn't that have a similar impact on political culture and so on? And I certainly it seems very true to me that in that post-Ramsay period, Ramsay threatened that political elite so strongly that they really reasserted themselves. I remember having an argument with Gordon Darcy, the Prime Minister, when I was still working in Aussay about how much money they were spending on tertiary scholarships. And he just gave me the rounds of the kitchen. You know, how dare you go and tell us what our priorities should be. Anyway, I don't really have a question. I just want to say thank you. I found it really stimulating. Lots more to think about.
Oh, thank you very much for the comment. That's a really good point. I struggled with identifying critical junctures, but it emerged through the research that those are the two critical junctures that stood out. And the way I see Solomon Islands' political economy dynamic was shaped by David Craig and Doug Porter's work on the durability of Solomon Islands political economy dynamic. And I think that reflected that the Ramsay intervention was a big opportunity to change institutions. But in fact, Solomon Islands political actors just shifted their transactional behaviour out of areas that had been subject to donor ring fencing. So they described the layering of practices and behaviours in Solomon Islands, where donors were operating on one layer and politicians were operating on a different one. But I'm also really conscious that I have had the benefit of an Australian higher education as an Australian, and I definitely don't want to be in the position of criticising Solomon Islanders for accessing higher education, because Solomon Islanders are still very much underrepresented in access to higher education. So I'm keen to take an objective, non-judgmental view of how the policy area works and who appears to be benefiting and why certain policy choices have been sustained.
Excuse my ignorance. It was really great, but wondering about your title, policy responses to employment in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. I mean, your case studies weren't kind of what I was expecting, because there wasn't necessarily a direct link with those case studies to actual employment being created in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu themselves. There seemed to be more about creating opportunities for income and how I would assume the tertiary education could be constructed in those terms. So I'm just wondering why the word employment, I suppose. Were they very much crafted as employment policies? Is that how they were badged when they were first developed?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it could well be argued that neither of the policy cases were specifically employment. They had mixed objectives. Overseas tertiary scholarships in both countries have a range of objectives, including leading development, status, coming back to lead the public service. But I chose case study areas that attracted a large amount of resources and that were highly publicly contested, and choosing more discrete individual employment policy responses, such as the rapid employment program in Honiara, wouldn't have been easily comparable to Vanuatu, and it also didn't attract a great deal of government attention, investment, or public debate, because it was significantly a donor initiative. So there are a number of heavily donor influenced and donor run employment programs, but they're not directly comparable between the two countries, and it's not really a focus of national policy making. So I took a broad approach to defining, well, what are the major domestic policy responses that have articulated to employment? And labour mobility has probably been the most significant employment policy response. Even though the actual employment is offshore, people still earn an income, bring it home, use it to start a livelihood. And labour mobility participation in Vanuatu is now so broad that a larger number of people participate in labour mobility schemes than work in the Vanuatu government. So it's the most significant and politically contested employment policy area in the Pacific in the last few decades. And I think the question is worth asking on overseas tertiary scholarships. If it's not an employment policy response, then why has it attracted such a large degree of government investment if the employment challenge in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu is so pressing?
I mean, the case studies were great. It was just policy responses to employment, just problematizing employment. Maybe it's policy responses to underemployment and stuff.
Oh yeah, I think.
To Solomon Islands and Vanuatu.
I think Run Duncan, Richard, yeah, it's probably shorthand for it's a policy response to underemployment, but I'm talking about employment being a wicked public policy problem in the Pacific, either employment or underemployment, having enough work, having quality work, having better livelihoods. I mean, employment has such problematic definitions already because it's so subjective to different people's needs, and the formal Western definition of employment really falls down in the Pacific, where people engage in cash for work for a range of reasons, and they may not want a wage job. Economists may assume that they do, and that's also part of the reason that it's so difficult to either measure employment, compare it between countries, or even compare it between survey events. And that's part of the reason why there isn't a clear understanding of what the trends on employment and livelihoods are in Pacific Island countries, because people can't agree a definition.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation, Steve. It was really great, highly structured. You got to the findings, and really well articulated what is in your thesis. And I just wanted to also mention here that Stephen's completed his PhD while pretty much working full time. And I think that's something that we should all really highly commend Stephen for doing, because it's quite rare, when we've got PhD students coming in, not many have to work on it over a number of years while also maintaining time. So
Right,
think
and
that
that
should be-
full time and relocating from country to
That's true.
country, being stuck in COVID and Myanmar. Yeah.
no, so I think
It's been very impressive.
I'm not
Yeah.
blessed with children, that's
but
Seeing
my,
who's in the chat.
my question for you, because of the way you structured that presentation, can you maybe just give people a bit of a flavour of your data collection? Because you're interviewing bureaucrats. How willing were they and forthcoming to talk about politics and potential issues with citizens? How did you find that whole process?
I found it a lot of fun. I was careful about the ethics of the approach, and I've been really careful to talk about my findings to try and avoid risk of people being personally identified from some of the claims of corruption that have arisen. So there's a participant coding system in the thesis that seeks to mitigate that risk. I mean, for people who've done research in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, the experience is often that people are surprisingly forthcoming, but then it was also very telling when people weren't forthcoming. And I really noticed the difference between Solomon Islands and Vanuatu on the overseas tertiary scholarships case study, that personalised and politicised selection was so much more overt and known about in Solomon Islands that people didn't say, oh yes, I personally gamed the system, but participants in Solomon Islands were much more forthcoming in saying, oh yeah, that manager of the National Training Unit was known to have taken bribes for awarding scholarships and was thrown out of the job afterwards. Whereas in Vanuatu, people had an experience of personalised selection happening, but the much more covert nature of it came through in people being less willing to identify individuals, especially current individuals. It was more of a 20 years ago thing. Yeah, I have a lot of rich quotes in the thesis from things that people have said, and that's where the politics comes in. Was also an often repeated phrase when I got like a third of the way through the interview questions of, well, why is this happening and why is this happening? And they would say, that's where the politics comes in. And so for me, that was a good reflection of the economic analyses that abound in studying Pacific employment are insufficient to explain what's going on, and political understanding is needed.
I think we've all been privileged to see the wonderful conversations you've had with your research participants. Very open, some that we've had to close off, but very open. For those that are online, feel free to place something in the chat or put your hand up if you want to Stephen?
Yes, I agree with James. It's really stimulating and it's so topical. Being from Vanuatu myself and having it observed, it's very, to mirror what you were saying. But I, with PEA, I always think that it's so easy to look at things in a vacuum. And so how do you approach that in the thesis in terms of, I think this speaks to Judy's point as well about the broader employment policy environment. And, with the scholarships as well, how that feeds into, so for example, as you know, in Vanuatu, the National Human Resource Development Plan, and how scholarships, in theory, regardless of who they're awarded to, are meant to line up some grander plan towards overall human resource capacity development. So how did you approach the bigger context around employment and linking education with employment, and not only jobs that are available in the Australian and New Zealand market, but in the domestic market? How do you handle that as part of the PEA?
That's a really good question. And I wrote a lot about these things, which I ended up cutting out in order to have a workable scope. In my time in the World Bank, I worked on the National Human Resource Development Plan in Solomon Islands. And so it was just one of the striking similarities between the two contexts that, hey, both these countries have the same policy responses to this problem, but the outcomes of experience is so different. I think that the broader employment policy context, there are signs that the demand-led skills development, strategizing, post-secondary education and training reform was supported with connected policy advocacy and collective action and mobilization of a political platform, for example, through the Vanuatu Skills Partnership, that was not present in Solomon Islands. And so looking at the broader trends in strategic employment policy, the move to a National Human Resource Development Plan reflected that there was both political leadership by at high levels of the government at the time, and a constituency of engaged policy stakeholders that weren't quite present in Solomon Islands, even though on paper the same policies were there. And I think that's reflected in the greater struggle that Solomon Islands has had in launching these policy initiatives, and the different experience of the establishment of national universities, which the National University of Vanuatu established in 2019, Solomon Islands National University established in 2013, but they both had quite different trajectories. And the National University of Vanuatu has much stronger international linkages than the Solomon Islands National University, for example. But I think the breadth and complexity of the question of education and employment is part of what makes it a wicked public policy problem, that people can't get their head around it. And politicians and policy actors are often very conscious of the problem of unemployed male youth in the street, but they don't know how to connect that to, well, if I join this committee to work on this specific policy, then we can work across stakeholders to achieve that change. That kind of connected multi-stakeholder policy advocacy was more possible in Vanuatu than in Solomon Islands, and I think that speaks to a difference in how collective action works in the two political economies. It's still difficult in Vanuatu, but there's been signs that it's been possible. But the widespread participation in labour mobility presented a whole range of different problems of success, including equity of participation, urbanisation, and the political impacts of returned labour mobility workers. So employment is still a complex, challenging public policy problem that involves stakeholders who may not even realise that they're part of a workforce development sector, but are actually essential to achieving sustainable change. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I've got another.
Yeah.
Yes, that's right. And it's just around, in terms of the cross-fertilisation of policy. So clearly there's a donor element in that, in terms of the serendipity of Solomon and Vanuatu looking similar,
Yeah.
perhaps in their policy approaches. But I kind of think also too that if there is that cross fertilization for donor differences, how much do you delve into the different donor presence in each of the countries as part of one of the key actors in this? Because I know from many conversations, and I think we might have worked together at some point even.
Yeah.
But you know, the Vanuatu post as an example for TSAT on aid, very different from the Solomon's post. And as locally engaged staff, hearing from both sides is completely different in the scope of how people can engage and operate with local stakeholders. So how much of that analysis do you bring into looking at the different actors as well and the factors shaping?
That's a really helpful point, because I've actually struggled to come up with as many findings on donor agency as I would have liked to, or as donors would be interested in me coming up with. But then, you know, donors can also be very, what about me? What about me? And a part of a part of the value of the research is focusing on national policymaker processes. But I totally agree from my experience of having worked with DFAT colleagues at the Australian High Commission in Port Vila and in Honiara. There's very different approaches, and also it comes down to very different personalities about whether an individual takes up a policy issue or not. And the variability of donor approaches was really evident on labour mobility, where in about 2011, 2012, the Partnerships for Development approach didn't even include labour mobility as one of the 25 targets that Australia expected Vanuatu and Solomon Islands governments to achieve. So, of course, Australia and New Zealand couldn't expect the partner governments to prioritise something that when they were giving them a list of aid conditions in other areas. But then Australia and New Zealand both started prioritising labour mobility around 2015 and heaped the pressure on Solomon Islands and Vanuatu to step up labour sending. I think part of the value of this research is that I've looked at a case study period of 12 years, which is so much longer than the lifespan of a posted officer in AusAid or DFAT or NZMFAT. And while the people I interviewed at the High Commissions were extremely knowledgeable, their knowledge didn't go back more than a couple of years. And that is a known and clear constraint on donors' long-term policy advocacy and engagement.
One more question.
Oh, that's another one.
Oh, yeah, I was going to go for it, Josie. Okay.
Excuse me for an anthropology question. Are you assuming that the nature of politics, both in terms of values and practices, are similar in both contexts, both countries? Or do you feel that you do tease out how politics in and of itself is different in the two different contexts? I mean, I know you talk about variabilities and the key actors that you outlined, but is there an unpacking, I guess, of what politics might mean?
I've got a chapter which describes how politics shapes policymaking in Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, and there's definite distinctions in how politics shapes policymaking. I think there are likely to be equally problematic concepts of what politics is in both Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, but I don't really unpack those definitions. I know in Vanuatu, there's a view that politic is poison and politics can be a dirty word. And I think there's also an element of that with donors, that globally donors depoliticize their development assistance because they don't want to engage in the politics of it, which is also problematic for dealing with the kind of issues that I've discovered in my research. So I took a political economy dynamic approach in both countries, looking at the overall political economy dynamic and what was happening, how that shaped policy making. how that shaped policy making on these employment policy responses, and then what specific sectoral political characteristics there were. So there was short-term transactional, localized and personalised politics in the political dynamics of both countries, but there were differences between Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. But what I found on the cultural debate was that the multiple cultures of Solomon Islands and the multiple cultures of Vanuatu made it difficult to generalize about how culture was shaping political action.
Yeah. Is James going to ask one? Stephen, it was great to hear that, mate. Congratulations. It's been amazing to see the effort you've gone through over such a long period of time, and the incredibly interesting and relevant findings you've come up with, but just your tenacity in sticking with this. And I say that out, I've got a great deal of respect for what you've done as a member of your cohort, and the knowledge, as Colin mentioned before, of what you've had to do throughout producing this PhD. So just want to say that on behalf of the cohort, really.
Thanks, Dan.
Appreciate the respect we have for what you've done. And just a quick question on the back of it. I think you answered it before, but it seems like you kept your analysis and your thinking open for the entire period, which is really what leads to the amazing advantage that a part-time PhD gets, because you end up with depth that no one else can really get in a full-time way. Was there a cut-off point where you just had to say, right, enough, I'm not doing anything beyond this year?
I wish.
Or you just kept going right up to now?
Yeah, I'm still adding references now.
That's the spirit.
Fortunately, the case study period ended in 2019, so
Yeah.
I can legitimately say, oh no, I'm not looking at that. But then also, so much interesting stuff happened in the years following that reflect, for instance, the 2019 labour mobility policy frameworks. It's only by looking at the subsequent debate in Vanuatu in the last 5 years that enables analysis of, well, was this policy framework actually effective or not? And I found that it was mostly a significant.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen, we have been the cutters, sorry, we have been the cutter offers a lot for Stephen, unfortunately, but what you have done has been really, really amazing. And today, it was so nice to see this presentation of paper. It was really good. You've done so well. But if anyone has any questions, I'm sure you'll be open to them, like via email or any other feedback that might help. But let's wish him well in his last mission.
I think there's a question in the chat. Oh, hi Aidan. Thanks for joining. It wasn't a question.
Okay.
That's good.
I'll say hi to him later.
Feel free to email me. I don't think I got questions online, so the online people might want to send something.
One you. Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you everyone for coming in again, Stephen. Thank you very much. We really look forward to your findings.
Thanks so much for lasting so long on the panel.
Everyone's talking in terms of decades. though.
11 years.
11 years, wow.
As long as I've worked in.
I was a young man when I started.
But it's been amazing.
Yeah.